You know what genuinely stopped me in my tracks a few years ago? I was reading about vegetable farming in South Korea and came across yield numbers that I assumed were a misprint. Korean smallholder farmers, working plots that most American gardeners would consider modest, were consistently harvesting 3 to 5 times more food per square foot than the standard benchmarks for home vegetable production in the United States. Not with better seeds, not with synthetic fertilizers or irrigation systems or anything that costs real money. The difference was in how they designed the relationships between crops. They weren't growing individual plants and trying to keep each one alive. They were growing plant communities where each species did something specific that made its neighbors grow faster and stronger. When I started studying what that actually looked like in practice, I realized I'd been gardening in a way that created work for itself at every step. A constant weeding because bare soil invited weeds, and constant fertilizing because the system didn't build fertility on its own. Constant pest management because the planting design made crops easy to find. Today, I want to walk you through exactly how Korean polyculture gardening works and how you can bring it into your own beds this season. At the end, I'll share one container technique that will change how you think about growing food in pots. I want to start with the observation that changed how Korean farmers thought about this centuries before modern soil science gave it language. When you walk through a natural woodland, you don't see organized rows of single species. You don't see bare soil anywhere. You see dozens of plants occupying the same square foot, roots reaching different depths, leaves capturing light at different heights, relationships between species that have sustained themselves without anyone weeding or fertilizing. Korean farmers looked at that and asked a question Western gardening never really got around to. What if we designed vegetable beds to work the same way, instead of growing isolated crops and intervening constantly? What if we created conditions where plants keep each other alive? That shift in framing is what Korean polyculture gardening is built on. And once you understand it, the techniques follow almost logically. The conventional Western approach treats the garden as a collection of individual crops, each with its own row, its own water, its own pest problem. Every plant in a monoculture row competes with its neighbors for the same nutrients in the same soil layer at the same time. Every row of cabbages sends out the same scent signal, making the entire bed easy for pests to locate. Every stretch of bare soil between rows becomes a weed nursery, demanding attention week after week. The system generates its own maintenance requirements. Korean growers identified the core problem. You have placed every plant in competition rather than cooperation. And the goal of polyculture is to replace that competition with relationships where each crop meets a need for its neighbors automatically, and the whole bed runs with a fraction of the labor. There are 4 core plant relationships that Korean farmers rely on to make this work, and each one addresses a specific limitation that conventional gardening handles with external inputs. The first is nitrogen sharing. Legumes like beans and peas host specialized bacteria in nodules on their roots, and those bacteria pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form plants can absorb. And a meaningful portion of that nitrogen leaks out into the surrounding soil through the root system. When Korean farmers plant beans within 12 inches of heavy feeders like peppers or corn, those neighboring crops access fresh nitrogen continuously without anyone adding fertilizer. Most Western gardeners grow beans in their own isolated row, which means all that free fertility just feeds more beans that are already making their own. The positioning is everything. The second relationship is pest confusion. Most garden insects locate their target crops through scent. A monoculture row of cabbage creates a scent signal concentrated enough that every pest looking for brassicas in the area knows exactly where to find them, and Korean farmers surround their cabbages with garlic, perilla, green onions, and other aromatic plants that layer competing scents over the target crop. A pest flies over, gets overwhelmed by mixed signals, can't isolate the target, and moves on to find easier ground somewhere else. No spraying, no hand picking, just design that makes crops harder to locate in the first place. The third relationship is structural cooperation. Tall crops become the support infrastructure for climbing crops. Corn stalks support bean vines. Sunflower stems carry cucumber tendrils. The garden builds its own scaffolding while the crops involved are simultaneously exchanging nutrients through the soil. The fourth relationship is living mulch. Sprawling crops like squash or perilla planted at the base of upright plants spread broad leaves across the soil surface. Weeds can't germinate without the light that leaf canopy blocks. Moisture stays in the soil rather than evaporating. Ground-dwelling pests that prefer bare, warm soil find the shaded environment inhospitable. One crop solves three problems that conventional gardeners spend hours managing separately. And I've been thinking about these principles for a long time, and I'm genuinely curious where you are with them. Have you tried any kind of companion planting before and found it worked or found it didn't? Drop a comment and tell me. I'm not asking to prompt engagement. I'm asking because the answers are usually more interesting than whatever I plan to say next, and they shape where I go with this content. The design process Korean farmers use starts with what they call the anchor crop, the primary vegetable you want to harvest. Almost always a heavy feeder like tomatoes, peppers, squash, or corn. Every other decision in the bed flows from what the anchor needs. Korean farmers ask 4 questions before they plant anything. Does this crop need nitrogen? If yes, a legume goes within 12 inches. Does this crop attract specific pests? If yes, aromatic companions go in a ring 6 to 8 inches out. Does this crop leave bare soil exposed around its base? If yes, a ground cover or sprawling plant goes into those spaces. Does this crop need support? Or can it provide support for something else? The answers to those 4 questions determine the entire planting map before a single seed goes in the ground. Let me walk you through how this works with a pepper-based design that Korean farmers have used for generations. Peppers are heavy nitrogen feeders, so bush beans go about 12 inches from the main stems, fixing nitrogen directly in the root zone. Peppers attract aphids and certain beetles, so garlic and green onions form a ring about 6 inches from each stem, masking the crop's scent while producing a secondary harvest. You'll actually use peppers leave significant bare soil around their base, so perilla or lettuce seedlings go into the gaps, serving as living mulch while producing yet another harvestable crop. That's 4 crops in the space you'd normally plant a few peppers and call done, and every one of them is making the others grow faster. The timing of how you get these plants into the ground matters almost as much as which plants you choose, and this is where I see most people go wrong when they first try polyculture. The impulse is to plant everything on the same day and let the system sort itself out. Korean farmers do not do this, and the reason is simple. If you plant squash at the same time as your corn, the squash germinates faster and spreads aggressively across the bed, shading corn seedlings before they can establish. If you plant beans before the corn has any height, the beans flop over with nothing to climb and compete with the corn at. And soil level, instead of growing vertically above it, you've created competition rather than cooperation because you ignored the sequence that the relationships require. The correct approach is staggered planting based on growth rate, and it's straightforward to execute. For a corn, bean, and squash combination, you start with the corn, let it grow until it's about 6 inches tall, roughly 2 to 3 weeks depending on soil temperature, then plant your bean seeds about 4 inches from each stalk. The beans germinate and begin climbing just as the corn gets tall enough to support them. 1 week after the beans go in, plant your squash around the perimeter of the bed. By the time the squash vine starts sprawling, the corn and beans are established enough not to be overwhelmed. For the pepper-based polyculture, transplant your pepper seedlings first and give them 2 weeks to establish and begin active growth. Then plant your garlic cloves or green onion sets in a ring 6 inches out, and your beans about 12 inches out. 2 weeks after that, tuck your perilla or lettuce into the remaining bare spaces. By that point, your peppers are tall enough that the low-growing companions won't compete for light, and everything finds its role without struggle. The principle Korean farmers follow is simple to say but takes discipline to practice. Give each crop the head start it needs to fulfill its function before the next crop enters the system. When you respect that sequence, cooperation happens naturally. When you skip it, you get the competition you were trying to design around. If you've stayed through all of this and you're finding it useful, please subscribe. I want to say that directly and personally rather than as a reflex, because I put a lot of care into these videos, and knowing that someone found it worth their full attention genuinely matters to me. That's the only reason I keep making them. The technique that ties everything together is called chop and drop, and it's the reason Korean garden soil gets richer every season while most Western gardens slowly deplete. When a crop finishes or when you prune back overgrowth, you cut the plant material and drop it directly onto the soil surface in the same bed. You don't bag it and you don't carry it to a compost bin somewhere else in the yard. You leave it where it falls. It breaks down in place, feeding the soil biology that will feed your next planting. The nutrient cycle stays closed inside the bed. Compare that to the conventional approach of raking beds clean, hauling everything away, and then buying bagged compost to replace what you just removed. So you have designed a system that exports nutrients and imports them back at a cost. Korean farmers eliminated that cycle generations ago by simply leaving what grew where it grew. In a mature Korean polyculture bed, chop and drop happens continuously without extra effort. When you harvest beans, the roots stay in the ground and decompose, releasing the nitrogen those root nodules have been building all season. When perla gets leggy, you clip it back and leave the cuttings at the base of the neighboring tomatoes as a nutrient-rich mulch layer. And when squash leaves age out at the end of the season, and you cut them off and leave them on the soil as food for the next generation of soil organisms. The bed is building fertility as you harvest, and by the end of the season, the soil is measurably better than it was in spring. That is the opposite of what most gardeners experience. Most of us end the season with soil that is more depleted than when we started, and we compensate for that by buying inputs the following year. Korean farmers designed their way out of that loop, and it's available to anyone willing to change the sequence of what they do when a crop finishes. Now for the container technique I mentioned at the start, because it demonstrates everything we've covered at the smallest possible scale. Most gardeners put a single plant in a container and leave the rest of the soil doing nothing. Korean growers look at that same pot and see a complete ecosystem waiting to be built in a single 20-gallon container. Plant your anchor crop in the center, and tomato or pepper in a ring about 6 inches from the stem. Plant garlic cloves or green onion sets at the edges of the container. Tuck in 3 or 4 marigold plants. What you've created is a functional polyculture in a pot. The tomato gets pest protection from the aromatics. The garlic gets the partial shade from the tomato canopy that it actually prefers. The marigolds suppress soil-dwelling pests through their root compounds while pulling in pollinators. Same container, same soil, same water, and dramatically better results from every plant involved because each one is doing something useful for its neighbors. What I find most useful about Korean polyculture gardening isn't any single technique. It's the underlying shift in how you ask questions. Instead of asking, how do I keep this plant alive? And you start asking, how do I create conditions where these plants keep each other alive? That question leads somewhere genuinely different. And the garden you end up with requires less from you while producing more. If you try any of this season, I would really like to hear what happens. Come back and tell me what worked, what surprised you, or what you'd change. Those conversations are the most useful thing that